terror, chaos, and carnage on a Southern California Christmas Eve. The man dressed as Santa armed himself with 4 guns and a makeshift...
A man in a Santa suit rang a doorbell on Christmas Eve, and for one small girl who ran to answer it, that was the last normal moment of her childhood. Within seconds, presents turned into gunfire, a family celebration turned into a crime scene, and a quiet street in Southern California became the site of one of the deadliest holiday massacres in American history. 9 people would not survive the night. An 8-year-old shot in the face somehow would. And the man behind the red suit wasn't a stranger at all. He was family. This is the story of the Covina Christmas Massacre, what really happened behind that door, and how the survivors chose to keep living afterward. It was December 24, 2008, in Covina, California, a peaceful, low-crime suburb about 22 miles east of Los Angeles. Joseph and Alicia Ortega, an elderly couple in their 70s, had spent decades building a tradition their entire extended family looked forward to every year, a big, loud, joyful Christmas Eve gathering at their home. On this particular night, roughly 25 family members and friends packed into the house. Their adult children, their spouses, grandchildren, nieces, nephews, and longtime neighbors who had become part of the family in every way that mattered. There was a poker game going, kids running around near the tree, and the kind of noise that comes from people who genuinely love being around each other. Nobody in that house had any reason to think this night would be different from any other Christmas Eve they'd shared for years. At around 11:30 that night, the doorbell rang. Nobody thought much of it. Santa Claus showing up at the door wasn't unusual for this family. A kind neighbor had played Santa for the kids in years past, arriving with a bag of gifts to hand out before the little ones went to bed. So when 8-year-old Katrina ran to the door and threw it open to a man in a full Santa costume, complete with beard, hat, and a big wrapped box on a trolley behind him, there was nothing alarming about it. She lit up and shouted his name with pure delight. That excitement lasted only a few seconds. Instead of handing her a gift, the man pulled 2 pistols from beneath his costume and shot the little girl in the face at point-blank range. Then he turned the guns on the rest of the room. What followed was chaos. Family members who had just been laughing over cards were suddenly diving for cover, some hiding under furniture, others breaking windows to escape with their bare hands. One survivor later described believing the popping sounds were balloons before realizing, in a horrifying instant, that they weren't. The gunman moved through the house methodically, and at least one relative recognized him immediately despite the disguise and called out his name before being killed. When the shooting stopped, the man doused the house with a homemade incendiary device built from pressurized fuel, essentially turning it into a flamethrower. And the living room went up in flames while people were still inside. Outside, terrified survivors who had managed to escape ran to neighboring homes for help, and Covina's emergency dispatch was suddenly flooded with calls at once, neighbors reporting an explosion, a house fire, and people fleeing in panic. It took firefighters, more than 80 of them, hours to bring the blaze under control. When the fire was finally out, investigators were left with a scene almost too devastating to process. 9 people dead, some killed by gunfire, others by the fire that followed. Their bodies burned badly enough that identifying them took time and forensic work. 3 more survivors, including young Katrina, were rushed to hospitals with serious injuries. As police began piecing together what happened, they quickly established one crucial fact. This was not a random act of violence. Whoever did this knew the family's Christmas Eve routine down to the smallest detail, including the fact that a familiar face in a Santa suit showing up around midnight wouldn't raise any alarm at all. That kind of intimate knowledge pointed investigators toward someone close to the family rather than a stranger. And that theory solidified almost immediately when Leticia, one of the Ortega daughters and Katrina's mother, told police something remarkable. Despite the costume, the beard, and the chaos, she recognized the shooter. It was her sister Sylvia's ex-husband, a man named Bruce Pardo. Bruce Pardo was, on paper, about as far from anyone's idea of a mass murderer as you could imagine. He was in his mid-40s, a graduate of California State University, Northridge, with a stable, well-regarded career as an engineer at the prestigious Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Friends and family described him as intelligent, articulate, and easygoing, the kind of person nobody would flag as dangerous. He had married Sylvia Ortega in early 2006, and by most accounts the early days of their relationship looked genuinely happy. He welcomed her children from a previous relationship, seemed engaged and supportive, and the couple appeared, at least from the outside, to be building a stable life together. That picture started to change after Bruce suffered a serious knee injury that required surgery and sidelined the active lifestyle he'd once enjoyed. According to people close to the couple, he became more withdrawn afterward, gaining weight and pulling away from a relationship in ways that left Sylvia feeling increasingly disconnected from the man she'd married. The relationship deteriorated further, and in March of 2008, Sylvia moved out. Their divorce was finalized just 1 week before the massacre, on December 17, 2008. But the divorce wasn't just about a marriage falling apart because two people had grown apart. As investigators dug deeper into Bruce's past, they uncovered something Sylvia had apparently learned only after they were already married, a devastating secret from years earlier. Bruce had fathered a son with a previous girlfriend, years before he ever met Sylvia. When that child, named Matthew, was just over a year old, Bruce had been left alone to watch him for a short time. During that window, the toddler ended up in a swimming pool and nearly drowned. He survived, but the lack of oxygen left him with permanent, severe brain damage, confining him to a wheelchair for the rest of his life. In the aftermath, Bruce reportedly walked away from both the mother and the child entirely, maintaining no real relationship with his son beyond court-mandated child support. When Sylvia discovered this history, it understandably shook her deeply, and associates close to the family believed it played a significant role in the collapse of their marriage and the bitterness that followed. That bitterness, according to investigators, curdled into something far darker in the days after the divorce became final. Evidence gathered by police painted a picture of a meticulously planned attack. Officers later discovered that Bruce had purchased 4 separate 9mm handguns in the lead-up to the massacre, along with a substantial amount of ammunition, and had built the homemade flamethrower device himself using pressurized jet fuel, apparently intending to erase evidence by burning the house and everyone inside it beyond recognition. He seemingly hadn't accounted for one crucial detail: the presence of an open flame inside the house once the fire reached him too, catching his own costume and badly burning both of his arms in the process. Even more chilling, investigators later determined the massacre wasn't meant to end at the Ortega house. On the same night, Bruce's brother, Brad Pardo, arrived home from his own Christmas gathering to find a scene police would later connect directly to the case. Bullet holes in his living room walls, a pistol on the floor, and Bruce himself, dead. Investigators believe that after fleeing the burning house, badly burned and in agony, Bruce made his way to his brother's home, where he ultimately took his own life. He was also found carrying more than $17,000 in cash strapped to his body, suggesting he may have intended to flee afterward, before the extent of his injuries made that impossible. Investigators also found something even more disturbing as they continued piecing the case together. Evidence suggesting the Ortega family and Bruce's brother's house weren't meant to be the only targets that night. A rental vehicle registered under Bruce's name was discovered parked suspiciously close to the home of Scott Nord, the attorney who had represented Sylvia during their divorce. The car was stocked with maps, supplies, and enough fuel to suggest Bruce may have planned to continue his attack there as well, a plan investigators believe was ultimately abandoned once his injuries from the fire became too severe to carry it out. Perhaps most chilling of all, relatives later revealed that Bruce's own mother had been invited to the Ortega family's Christmas Eve gathering that night and would have been present, and likely among his targets, had she not stayed home because she wasn't feeling well. While all of this horror was unfolding, one small piece of good news reached investigators on Christmas Day itself. Katrina, the 8-year-old shot in the face at the front door, had survived. The bullet had entered near the side of her mouth, and doctors treating her noted that survival from a wound like that was rare. Most victims shot in the head or face at close range do not live. She did. Her recovery would become one of the few points of light in an otherwise devastating tragedy, and it would go on to shape the rest of her life in ways nobody in that house could have predicted on Christmas Eve. In total, 9 members of the Ortega family lost their lives that night. Joseph and Alicia Ortega, the couple who had hosted the gathering for decades, their son Charles and his wife Sherry, their son James and his wife Teresa, their daughter Alicia and her 17-year-old son Michael, and Sylvia herself, Bruce's ex-wife, the woman whose divorce had apparently triggered the entire attack. Letitia, one of the Ortega daughters, was the only one of the 5 adult siblings to survive, having escaped the house with her injured daughter and several nieces and nephews. She would later describe hiding beneath furniture as the shooting unfolded and calling 911 from a neighbor's house while frantically trying to reach family members who would never answer their phones again. The scale of loss for this one extended family is difficult to fully comprehend. In a matter of minutes, Letitia lost both of her parents, 2 brothers, a sister, 2 sisters-in-law, and a teenage nephew. Sylvia's own children, including her 19-year-old son and her 6-year-old daughter, both survived the fire and gunfire, but lost their mother that night. In the aftermath, Letitia made the decision to take in her young niece, effectively becoming a mother to both her own injured daughter and her sister's orphan child, while processing grief on a scale most people will thankfully never have to face. What followed in the years after the massacre wasn't just recovery. It became something closer to a mission for several of the survivors. Letitia has spoken publicly about the choice she made in the immediate aftermath, to let herself feel the grief fully, without pretending it wasn't devastating, while also refusing to let that grief define the rest of her family's life or be passed down to the children who depended on her for stability. She's described wanting to be an example of resilience for the children in her care, showing them that acknowledging pain and moving forward with hope were not mutually exclusive. Katrina, the little girl who survived being shot in the face at her own front door, grew into a teenager who refused to let that night define her as a victim. Nearly a decade later, in the wake of the deadly Parkland, Florida school shooting in 2018, 17-year-old Katrina organized a walkout with her classmates, publicly reading the names of the Parkland victims and speaking out about the toll of gun violence in America, drawing a direct line between what had happened to her own family and the students killed in that later tragedy. She's continued that advocacy work in the years since, describing it as a way of honoring the family members she lost while working to prevent other families from experiencing the same devastation. Even something as loaded with painful memory as Christmas itself became something the family refused to surrender. Rather than treating the anniversary of the massacre as a date defined purely by horror, survivors have spoken about deliberately choosing to keep celebrating the holiday, treating it as a continuation of the joy their parents and grandparents had built the tradition around in the first place, rather than letting one night of unimaginable violence erase decades of family memories. Looking back, investigators who worked the case have described it as one of the most calculated and disturbing crimes they've ever encountered, not just because of the sheer number of victims, but because of how deliberately it was planned and how narrowly it avoided becoming even worse. Had circumstances gone even slightly differently, had Bruce's mother felt well enough to attend, had the attorney's house been hit as apparently planned, the death toll could have climbed significantly higher. Instead, what remains is the story of a family that lost 9 of its members in a single night to someone they trusted, and the survivors who chose, deliberately and repeatedly, not to let that loss be the final word on who they were. The Ortega family story is a difficult one to sit with, but it's also, in its own way, a story about what people are capable of rebuilding even after the worst possible night imaginable. 9 lives were taken by someone the family never suspected capable of this kind of violence. And yet the people left behind turned their grief into advocacy, into resilience, and into a determination to keep their family's memory and their traditions alive for the generations that came after. If this story moved you, let us know your thoughts in the comments. And stick around for more true accounts of the events that tested ordinary families in the most extraordinary ways.